Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the Internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more. Today we've got a fascinating guest who's expert on a fascinating subject that is central to jazz. His name is Al Jackson, and he's proprietor of Tremaine's Petit Jazz Museum in New Orleans, and that is someplace that you absolutely must visit next time you go to New Orleans. And while you're waiting to go to New Orleans, I want to encourage you to go and take a look at it right now. Take a look at his Facebook page. Hey, Al, welcome.
Good morning, Ken. How are you this morning?
I'm really good. I had a great opportunity to visit with Al several months ago and see the museum and just travel around town with him, and I got quite an education in a short period of time. So what I'm going to try to do with the time that we have on this call is share as much of that education with you. Al is an expert on the roots of jazz, the Caribbean roots, the Creole roots, and that is what the Tremaine's Petit Jazz Museum is dedicated to, and it has some incredible artifacts, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the call. But first, we're going to talk about arguably the most important person in the history of jazz, and I'm talking, of course, about Louis Armstrong. It's hard, if not impossible, to imagine our music without him. And there's so many myths or misunderstandings or things that people just don't know about Louis Armstrong, and even people that think they know. You may have seen a few documentaries, you may have read some books, and we're going to talk about some things that are going to maybe surprise you. So first of all, let's address one of the big topics, Al, if you would. Louis Armstrong told everybody that he was born on the 4th of July, 1900. And, I think he was an honest man. I mean, that's what he believed was true. And I don't think he had any reason, I don't think there's any history of him making things up in his life. But later, much later, supposedly, some researchers found a document that say, oh, no, he wasn't really born then. He was actually born August 4th in 1901. So, Al, tell me what you told me about that.
Well, as I've said before, we, at our jazz museum in New Orleans, Tremaine's Petit Jazz Museum, we, like you and many other folk, we believe that Pops had no reason to lie. And we were able to find, through our research, his World War I draft card with his mother's signature, which clearly reads, 4th of July, 1900, as a musician playing in Sperryville for Peter Lala, and that's 100 years ago. So we believe that. In addition to which, we also were able to procure through the Library of Congress a copy of his passport leaf, 1932 and 1937, 1961 and 1937, from both France and Mexico, returning to the United States. Particularly of interest is the one from Mexico, because at that time he lived in Corona, New York, and that's, of course, is illustrated on his passport leaf. And the birthday remains the same, July 4th, 1900, Louis Armstrong. We have yet to see something official which states August the 4th, 1901. And I don't know of anyone who has seen anything as an official document which would speak to an August the 4th, 1901 birthday. And I'd like just to add this, that he was supposedly baptized at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, part of the city known as Mid-City, which, if we really appreciate the chronology of the conversation, 1896 is when America, which included Louisiana and New Orleans, became a segregated society. black, white, nothing in the middle. Plessy versus Ferguson, by the way, who was also born in Treme, Homer Adolph Plessy. So 4 years or 5 years, either one, after the entire country had become segregated, your church, my church, that's it and that's all, why would one even suspect that Louis Armstrong, who was not Creole, would be baptized in a Roman Catholic church in a part of New Orleans where even today the demographics suggest less than 10% occupancy of folk of African ancestry. This is 2018. You can imagine 1900.
And that church is not in the neighborhood that he lived, which, as we know in New Orleans, people are very dedicated to their neighborhoods. They're not going to go out of their neighborhood to a different church to get baptized, generally.
Not at all. Not at all. And in addition to which, if his mom or his grandmother would have wanted him to be baptized Catholic, there was, in fact, one and only one. St. Augustine at that time had been off-limits to folk of African ancestry. So the only church in the city which accepted African-American Roman Catholic Church, that is, was St. Catherine, the 1500 block of Tulane Avenue. And folk who've been here before might know where this is, downtown in what was nearly known as the Tango Belt, which is where 3 blocks from South Rampart, the Pigeons Temple, all the black music was 4 blocks from that church where black folk lived as well, including his mother, who would eventually live 3 blocks from that church at 1233 Perdido Street, 2.5 blocks from Tulane Avenue. That was his neighborhood. That's where he lived. That's where his mother lived. He was born back of town by Jane Alley, which is in the general vicinity of Mid-City, but the folk who lived in that neighborhood who were Roman Catholics attended Roman Catholic services at St. Catherine, not at Sacred Heart.
Gotcha. And so when people say, and I've heard this said, I've seen it in documentaries, I've heard it repeated many times, that there is a baptismal certificate from the church that you mentioned that shows that he was born August 4th. There is no one has seen this baptismal certificate that everybody keeps talking about.
I've never seen it. I don't know if anyone in New Orleans, including musicians and historians, as well as Bruce Rayburn from the Tulane Hogan's Jazz Archives, have never seen such an instrument. In addition to which, I've asked before she passed on Miss Phoebe Jacobs, and we all knew who Miss Phoebe Jacobs was. She was the lady who operated the Louis Armstrong Foundation after his passing. I asked her, sitting in St. Augustine's Church one Sunday during the Satchmo festivities, I said, Miss Phoebe, have you ever seen such a baptismal certificate? And she said, Al, categorically, no.
Very interesting. Now, there is a literal scrap of paper that somebody produced that's not an official certificate of any kind, baptismal, birth, or otherwise. It's really just a piece of paper.
Just a piece of paper.
What can you tell us about that piece of paper, its provenance, if you know it, and what's on it? And
well, the piece that I've seen as I read one of these books on jazz and Louis Armstrong, it reads, Louis Armstrong, Nègre Illégitimé, which is French for illegitimate black, and the date August the 4th, 1901.
But it's just a piece of paper.
Just a piece of paper. Nothing official about it at all. No heading, no closing.
Amazing.
No signature.
And it's certainly not on an official document. It's not sealed. It's not in the records anywhere. It's just a piece of paper.
Piece of paper.
So I'm going to say, jazz fans.
And let me just add this to the conversation.
Yep.
For your listeners who are not familiar with the Afro-Creole culture here in Louisiana, or more specifically New Orleans, even the enslaved Africans who were baptized into Roman Catholic faith would have had a baptismal certificate on file at the St. Louis Cathedral or at the Archdiocese of New Orleans.
But
I have one. I'm Roman Catholic. I'm Roman Catholic, and I have a baptismal certificate, as well as my siblings and my children.
But so far, nobody's found an official baptism certificate for Louis Armstrong.
As of today, May the 21st, 2018, no.
Great. So
I would love to see it. I would love to see it.
Yeah, I bet. I know as a historian, you definitely, I'm sure you'd be the first to want to see it, whatever it says. So jazz fans and Jazz on the Tube listeners, I'm going to say that until we see some kind of legitimate birth certificate or baptismal certificate on real paper, signed, notarized, or whatever is required for a document to be official, this scrap of paper that's floating around that disputes Louis Armstrong's account of his birth, I think we should go with what Louis says. So I'm back to July 4th, 1900.
And that's us. We celebrate the 4th of July 1900. Pop said it. That should have been good enough for the jazz world, for everybody, really. If he said it, that's it.
Yeah. So let's look at something else that should be of interest to jazz fans. A lot of people think that Louis Armstrong was born somewhere in the vicinity of what is now called Armstrong Park. So let's talk about if somebody actually wants to go to the area, the site where Louis Armstrong was born, where do they actually go?
They would have to actually physically go on South Broad Avenue on a corner of between Gravy and Perdido, which is adjacent to the Municipal and Traffic Court buildings and the police headquarters in the rear. Those homes, including the home of his grandmother, where he was born, were all demolished to make room, eminent domain, to make room for a traffic court, municipal court, and a police headquarters in a section we call Back of Town. And if they come to the Jazz Museum, I would gladly give them a tour of that property.
That's great. And for people that are curious about the address, is there a specific address there?
It would have been at that time 723 Jane Alley.
723 Jane Alley. And Al did take me there, and it's a shame that they didn't somehow preserve that place, because it's like Abraham Lincoln's log cabin. I mean, it really should have been saved. But in a weird way, probably without intending it, they actually created a beautiful, pretty permanent shrine to Louis Armstrong, because the place, there is a marker stone, which we could talk about in a second. There's a marker stone, but it's also beautifully landscaped, and there's trees, and it's quite a nice spot. Trees are always nice in New Orleans because you get some shade in the hot, when the sun's beating down on you, so it's a nice place to be. And because the police headquarters, not headquarters, but the court and some other city buildings are right there, that place is likely to remain for a long, long time. In fact, if it ever hits the fan, probably one of the safest places in the whole city is going to be right there, because
exactly.
It's a very important city area. So maybe they didn't intend that, but that's what the end result is. So there is a marker. Can you tell us a little about the marker stone there?
Yeah, there's a marker as well as a street sign which indicates number 1 Jane Alley, that I'm proud to say myself, along with my fellow members of my parading organization, the Black Men of Labor, we were able to collaborate with then Mayor Mark Morial, who is now in New York at the Urban League, and also recruited assistance of the Preservation Resource Society. And collectively, we got together and got the street sign up, number 1 Jane Alley, as well as this marker which reads, birthplace of Louis Armstrong, 723 Jane Alley, demolished in 1864.
That's great. And we're talking with Al Jackson, who's the director of Tremaine's Petit Jazz Museum in New Orleans, and we're talking about the true story of Louis Armstrong. So we've addressed the birth date, and I think that's going to be big news for people that are listening to this call, because I know there are a lot of serious fans out there that have bought the idea that he was mistaken. And we just want to reiterate, there is absolutely no legitimate documentation that he was born any other day than the day he and his mother said. Now we know where he was. Now we know, thanks to Al and his colleagues, not only where he was born, but there's a marker there. So when you go there, you can see it. Let's talk about another big Louis Armstrong myth, which is that he abandoned New Orleans and he just stopped coming back. And now you have talk about documentation. You've got some amazing documentation that shows that simply is not true. First, let's talk about how you came across it, which is, of course, the origins of Tremaine's Petit Jazz Museum.
In 1997, as I was driving along North Claiborne Avenue, on the way to my grandmom's house, I saw this abandoned building, which immediately I recognized as having been the home of the Negro Musicians Union, of which Louis Armstrong was, in fact, a member, contrary to popular belief as well. I did some research at the public land records, discovered that I knew the owner, made contact, made an offer, and myself, along with the fellow named Paul Sylvester, who is the owner of Sweetland Range Jazz Club in New Orleans, and the great-great-grandson of Victor Eugene McCarthy, who was a Creole pianist composer in the 18th century. We bought the building and went in to clean it up, and like, oh my God, there was a treasure trove of documents strewed all over the floor, strewn all over the floor. Couldn't believe my eyes. Louis Armstrong contract, 1954, here in $1,000 in Biloxi, Mississippi, at the Broadwater Beach Hotel and Golf Course on the Gulf of Mexico. 1954.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it.
So you found a lot of contracts with very famous people's names signed to them. You also found a logbook, for lack of a better word, that logged in all the union scale performances that took place in the city during a specific period of time.
Yeah, the ledger dates from 1941 through 1952. And within that ledger, of course, besides Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Pearl Bailey, Ray Charles, Count Basie, Duke, Cooter Brown, Earl Father Hines, I could go on and on and on with the list of names, but Louis appears in that ledger minimally 14 times between 1941 and 1952.
And this was reputed. Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead, please.
And of course, this is in stark contrast to what people have been saying, that he never came home. Sure, there was some animosity, I'm certain, after a while, between Louis and the city. We are not here to say that animosity happened before his home was demolished. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know when the animosity might have begun and or why that animosity began. But Louis did not forsake his community. When I say his community, I'm not speaking on behalf of the city of New Orleans. Remember, we're still living in a segregated city. But Louis certainly played, performed, and brought folk with him to New Orleans. A case in point would be the father of Captain Russell, who was a vocalist in New York. Her father, Louis, L-U-I-S, Russell, Louis friended his band for 10 years, and Louis Russell, as well, was in and out of New Orleans with and without Louis Armstrong. And, of course, he was born in Cologne, Panama. Another influence from the Caribbean that would be brought to New Orleans, and he was a pianist with his own band.
You said there were 14 different occasions during that time period where Louis Armstrong performed, according to the union's own ledger.
According to the union's own ledger, he performed in New Orleans and or Mississippi.
So here's this another incredible myth, busted, basically, conclusively, really. And they talk about not having documentation. Here's a case where there is absolutely crystal clear documentation. So the idea that Louis Armstrong didn't return to his, and this is a very important point I was making, to his community, is just completely false. Now, there's something that we talked about briefly in New Orleans, and we didn't prepare to talk about this, so we'll just take it where it goes if we can handle this topic. But another myth about Louis Armstrong that's always repeated. I mean, they never miss an occasion to say this. They always say, his mother was a prostitute working out of the cribs of New Orleans. What do you say to that?
Malarkey.
Wow.
Now, of course, I was not born back then. and those folk who were making those allegations as well were not born back then, 100 years ago. But because she lived in a rooming house with men and women at 1233 Perdido, which was not listed as a crib, a rooming house with musicians living there as well, that does not and did not make her a prostitute. What she did for a living is none of my concern and should not be the concern of anyone else. For a man who achieved such stardom, coming out of a very humble, more than humble situation, And 100 years later, for us to be discussing his legacy speaks volumes of his character, part of which I would assume he got from his mother and his grandparents and his father. Because in 1949, he came back home and reigned as King Zulu as a tribute to his father, who also had reigned previously as King Zulu of the Mardi Gras Carnival season.
Well, that's a whole other topic I'd like to get into then. That's news as well, to me at least. So there's no documentation. She lived in a normal housing arrangement for the time. She wasn't living in a crib. She wasn't living in a brothel. So where do you think people are coming up with this? And again, it seems like every biography feels the need to start out with that. And it's kind of since nobody really, it doesn't seem that anybody knows, it seems sort of slanderous to me. I mean, the fact that somebody is raised in a neighborhood where all kinds of so-called criminal activity goes on doesn't mean that that person or his family was involved in it or not. I mean, there's no way to tell.
Ken, my answer to that would be quite simple. It's called Hollywood and sensationalism at the expense of the character of two decent individuals. When his mother signed her name in 1918, where he enlisted for the draft for World War I, to me, that spoke volumes of their patriotism and their character. No one is talking about his World War I volunteer enlistment for the draft for World War I. No one talks about that. Well, what are they afraid of? He was a patriot. He volunteered to serve his country.
You know, it's true. I never heard that story that he was a volunteer in World War I.
He volunteered for the draft. He was not drafted, but he did, in fact, go down and sign up for the draft, which made him eligible to go to France because America fought alongside of the French army back then, not involved directly in the war. But he did, in fact, sign up for the draft, and as I mentioned early on, a copy of his draft registration adorns our wall and on the Louis Armstrong side of the wall. And we're proud of it.
Yeah, you know, I speaking of his patriotism, I had a chance recently to see a bit of film, and who knows, this might be the cause of some people feeling they need to rewrite history. But you're probably aware of this footage too. This was when he had arranged to go with the State Department to Russia, and this was right in the middle of all the, sort of atrocities that were taking place in Arkansas and other places. And he was interviewed at the airport, I think, getting on or off a plane, and he didn't mince any words about his disappointment with how the president at the time was carrying himself, and was very honest about what he would have to say if he was sent to Russia and people asked him that he was going to tell the truth. Now, if we turn the clock back to that era of time for anybody, black or white, musician or butcher, baker, or candlestick maker, to get in front of a camera and speak against the president, that took a lot of courage. And to me, that's a form of patriotism right there, to use your First Amendment.
And you're right. It took a lot of courage for him to have done that, and he did. And we don't see the kind of courageous verbiage today from many of our musicians. No one is like mums the word, but Pops did speak up and speak out.
And it was a weird phenomenon because just a few years later, really a few years in the scope of time, in the 60s, some people were saying, "Oh, that Louis Armstrong, he's old hat, he's an Uncle Tom, he's this, he's that." And then when you see that footage, I mean, right in the middle of probably the most conventional-minded time in American history, where everybody was towing the line and nobody wanted to say anything about anything, he was willing to put his career on the line to speak the truth in defense of his people. So how anybody 5 years or 10 years later could say, "Oh, well, this guy's, he's not connected, he's not standing up." It's absurdity, absolute absurdity.
And Ken, those are the same people who did not delve deep enough into his past, who would have ascertained for themselves that here is a World War I draft registration which says he stood up for his country. He was prepared to offer his life for his country. Had he been drafted, he did sign up for it. And oh my gosh, here's a birth date, 100 years ago, 1918. They've not delved that far because that makes sense. That makes them credible. And some folks don't have a desire for credulity. It's sad.
Yeah. Well, we're doing our best right now to start setting the record straight. And again, we're talking about actual documentation. We're not talking about how we wish things were or how we think they should be. The reality, there is no birth certificate or baptismal certificate in particular that shows any other date than what Louis Armstrong and his family said when he was born. That's number one. Number two, he returned to New Orleans numerous times to perform in his community at a time when historians say he didn't come back. Number three, there's no documentation of any kind that supports the theory that his mother was a prostitute. And I got to just say to all the biographers out there and people writing this stuff, be serious. You're not even serious when you attribute something and say it's a reality when you can't even show any, even circumstantial evidence. Right? Again, you can't just say, well, they lived in a neighborhood that had a lot of stuff going on. Therefore, I mean, that would be, could you imagine if somebody said that about you? Or about your mother? I mean, my God, and yet this passes. This seems to be acceptable when discussing someone who's arguably one of the most esteemed Americans who ever lived, certainly in the 20th century. So anyway, I'm glad we had a chance to address some of these things. Let's talk about another issue.
Well, Ken, before we move on, Ken? Yeah. Before we move away from his returns to New Orleans, one date I'd like to mention to the listening audience, and this is something which is real, which is also verifiable. 1968, Louis performed at his first and last New Orleans Jazz Fest, along with Duke Ellington, Jerry Mulligan, Dave Brubeck, Woody Herman, Pete Fountain, Joe going to Chicago Williams, Lurleen Hunter, Ramsey Lewis, 1968, 50 years ago this month, May the 16th through the 19th. And no one talks about that. Wow. We have the posters which we're offering through our GoFundMe page as well.
Oh, that's great.
We have a poster created enough so that we can offer this to people around the world who are Louis Armstrong and jazz aficionados. To me, this should be a part of every jazz aficionado's collection. A 1968 Louis Armstrong Jazz Fest poster.
Wow. So there was, for people that don't know this, there was a Jazz Fest before current Jazz Fest that we all know. And
1949, first one.
Wow. Amazing. And by coincidence, we didn't plan this, but by coincidence, literally 50 years ago, almost to the day, Louis Armstrong was performing at the original Jazz Fest with a stellar group of all-star players. Well, let's talk about 1896, and this is something that supposedly we're supposed to be taught in school, but I don't think the significance of that is ever made clear. So tell us again what happened in America, in the United States in 1896 that changed things for the whole country, but in particular for New Orleans?
Okay, then I should start with the ending of Reconstruction, when President Rutherford B. Hayes asked the Southern generals not to challenge his election, which was in question, and he would remove federal troops from the South. That was the final nail, or the second to final nail in the coffin. Things became progressively worse for people of African ancestry, which included Afro-Creoles as well. So you can imagine folk who were not Creole at all, it's unmixed. So in 1890, Louisiana enacted the Rail Car Separation Act. That act was challenged by the Comité Citoyen, or the Citizens Committee, headed by Dr. Charles Louis Roudanet and Paul Trevine of L'Union newspaper, which is a bilingual Afro-Creole newspaper, which had a circulation also in Paris, France. That connection was never really broken between Afro-Creoles in Louisiana and those who were in France either. So it meandered through the courts until in 1896 it found itself at the Supreme Court, where Judge Ferguson would rule that America would become a segregated society, the birth of Jim Crow. Black, white, nothing in the middle. And this is the time frame within which Louis Armstrong was born.
So he was born as the dust was settling on this sort of cataclysmic change, because it was socially cataclysmic.
It was, because those Afro Creoles who used to perform for white audiences, we called it Uptown on the other side of Canal Street, lost their gigs. And these were Francophone guys. A few had meandered across the line to perform with Buddy Bolden in the late 1980s, late 1990s rather. But by and large, the Afro Creoles were still playing Francophonic music in their homes and their parlors with the best of Cuban cigars and French wine. General was making a little noise around, well, much later on. He was born in 1890, so he was too young even to play ragtime. But that sound of music, the stride syncopation, had begun with Louis Gacho. Of course, General would perfect it. The country was just a divided country. Black on one side, white on the other side, black churches, white churches, and black schools, white schools, the few that there were for black children. That was it.
And that was something.
That's what the country was.
And that was something enforced by law. It wasn't something, certainly wasn't something that was the case in New Orleans before the changes of the law.
No, not at all. Not at all.
This thing that everybody's, working towards and talking about, which, diversity, that already existed in this country. That was the norm.
That was the norm during Reconstruction. One was free to marry, or free to associate with whomever they wanted to associate.
And then a law, these laws came in, and you couldn't. Well, let's talk about, for instance, the Dewdrop Inn much later. But in the 1950s, Dr. John talks about routinely getting arrested for simply going to the Dewdrop Inn and performing with black musicians.
Exactly.
I mean, it was a regular occurrence for him.
It was, and eventually the police stopped raiding. He did it anyway, and many other folk from the other side of the street also. Frank Pena, who was the founder of the Dewdrop Inn, said, "This is my club, and everybody's welcome." And he continued to allow equal access to everyone until the police just stopped raiding.
But basically what was happening, if you can imagine this, listeners, you'd be out hearing music with your fellow citizens, and next thing you know, the police are coming in, taking everybody away in handcuffs to jail for violating the law of blacks and whites could not be in the same entertainment space at the same time.
Exactly. So we can imagine how Louis felt about that when he would travel throughout Europe, treated as royalty, travel throughout Africa, treated as royalty, South America, the Caribbean, treated as royalty, and to come back home and say, "Okay, boy, you cannot go over there. You've got to go on the other side." Not a nice feeling.
No, and yet, as we pointed out, he did come back and he played in the black clubs and for his community. So he, in fact, did return to New Orleans. I think it's just such a major error in the public history is just almost appalling that something so easy to dispute is still circulating around. So there would have been pre-1896 and pre these laws, there would have been Afro-Creole musicians playing in the opera.
Absolutely. Going back to the early 1800s at the Théâtre d'Orléans. Today is the Bourbon Orleans Hotel, down in Orleans on the corner of Bourbon. They were dancing to the polka, waltz, and mazurka, to French classical music.
So, and then in 1896, it was no more. These musicians that had been working in these fields for a century, nearly a century, suddenly were told, don't come back to work?
Don't come back. You cannot play any longer.
Incredible. Now, part and parcel of this, there was also a steady erasure of the historical record of the contributions, the huge contributions, especially when you're talking about a place like New Orleans, the huge contributions of the Afro-Creole population of New Orleans. And so what was the basic process there? Suddenly somebody that accomplished a lot was no longer talked about, no longer written about, no longer included in the historical record.
I think at this point I can quote one of our former presidents. It was either Nixon, and I believe it was President Nixon, or it might have been, it was Nixon. Nixon used two words, benign neglect. Benign neglect.
Yeah. I think that was Senator Patrick Moynihan, believe it or not.
Okay.
And the theory was, we're going to do, we won't hurt them, but we're not going to do anything to help or even acknowledge their contributions. We won't actively go after them.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Benign neglect.
Yeah, so benign neglect.
So tell us a little bit about, tell us a little bit about we'd be on this call for a year before we get to the end of it all, but tell us just a little bit about the some of the people who should be better known, who were Afro-Creoles, who were just basically written out of the historical record.
Well, I wouldn't say that they were written out of the historical record, but they should be better known. Edmond Dede would be the first one who would come to my mind, classically trained violinist by Ludovico Gabici, as well as all these guys were trained in Paris at the Sorbonne, the Paris Conservatory of Music. Victor Eugene McCarthy, Charles and Sidney Lambert. Sidney would move to Lisbon, Portugal, Charles to Rio de Janeiro. The name which most folk can relate to immediately is Louis Moro Gacho, who was considered by us as the father of syncopation, and out of syncopation would come ragtime music. These guys are known on a master's and or a PhD level of education. But anything below that, and if you're not a researcher, you'll never find it. It gives too much credibility to the ingenuity of folk of Afro-Creole ancestry.
Thank you for that distinction. They're not literally written out of the history. If you are a PhD or if you are a very serious scholar with lots of time to devote to this, you will know who these people are, what they did, their contributions. But if you're just someone who is getting the official story on how things happened, you might not even realize there were Afro-Creoles in New Orleans, and you might not have any idea the extent of their contributions because it's just they're not highlighted.
And Cuba as well, which is one of our sister countries. Jose Sylvester Whitey Lafitte was recruited by Louis Moro Gacho, and Gacho paid his tuition for him to study in Paris. Returned to Cuba, wasn't comfortable, and went back to Paris. It's just amazing. In Brazil, the same. You have to really, really be a researcher, a serious researcher, and or a PhD scholar in music before these names will come across your desk or your laptop.
And when we're talking about American music, we have to talk about New Orleans because so much of what we know as American music had its origins either in New Orleans or New Orleans made a huge contribution to it. So and of course the music doesn't come out of a vacuum. It doesn't appear in the minds of a few select geniuses. It's a product of culture. There has to be a cultural infrastructure for musicians to learn their craft and to get together and to perform, and then out of that some geniuses emerge like Louis Armstrong. But you can't look at even someone like Louis Armstrong, you can't look at him in a vacuum. You have to say, okay, what was the culture that made this possible? And the people who made the musical culture of New Orleans possible, the very soil that it grows in, the Afro-Creole community.
And here's a footnote to that. When we speak about Louis Armstrong, when folk have spoken about Louis Armstrong, there's one name that has never been mentioned that I've ever heard. And that name is Captain Joseph Jones, a musician who served under Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill in Santiago de Cuba during the Spanish-American War. It was he and his wife, Manuela Duplessis, who opened the first that Colors Waifs home for boys, where Louis was taught alongside of Peter Davis and Captain Joseph Jones to play the bugle first, and then he would learn to play the cornet. The bugle would instill discipline and responsibility in Louis because it became his responsibility to wake the other boys up. They brought their military training to the Waifs home as a elementary type boot camp for these young kids. Kid Rene, by the way, was also at the Waifs home with Louis.
I'm sorry, who's that name you mentioned?
Kid Rene.
Oh, okay.
Another Creole musician who has not received any sort of recognition that he should have. The story is so deep. It is so deep and has so much depth into it. How the music and the players came in and out of New Orleans and would eventually create the sound we all have come to love, known as jazz and rag.
Well, I'm glad you added that part to the history because I think most people are aware that, or most people that follow this are aware that Louis did end up in a boys' home He had shot off a gun in the street, and during a holiday, and it was not an unusual thing for people to do, but it was not a thing that he should have done, and he ended up in a boys' home, and luckily it wasn't one of the homes or one of the facilities. We can't call them homes in any sense, where young people are sent today when they're in trouble. It was a place where people actually cared about them and did things to help them develop. And again, without this Mr. Jones that you mentioned, Captain Jones,
Captain Joseph Jones.
I think it's fair to say if Captain Joseph Jones didn't come back from the war in Cuba with this intention to help young people and put together the school, the home, the way he did, we might not have a Louis Armstrong.
Might not
have. We probably wouldn't. There's a lot of things that have to go right for anybody to survive. And when you've got as many challenges, financial challenges, economic challenges, social challenges, and no advantages of any kind, every little bit helps. And that opportunity to learn the bugle and learn some self-discipline and be exposed to playing with others and discover that he had a talent he might not have even known he had, all that came from the fact that this colored waifs home existed, and that waifs home existed because of Captain Jones. So that's why I say when you look at the artists, good, that's obviously they're the ones that are playing for us. But if you're really interested in the music, ask, how did that artist come to be? Who were the people? What was the community? What was the neighborhood? What was the culture that existed that made it possible for musicians to flourish? And that culture contributed to massively by the Afro-Creole musicians of New Orleans, who were playing pre-1896 in the Opera House and in all over the city, and then suddenly found themselves basically fired from their jobs.
Basically fired. You're right. Their revenue stream was diminished greatly, which connects the dots. How did these guys survive? What did they have to do? Well, they had to suck it up, go uptown, where Bud and Bowling and his boys were, and they would merge these bands together with their reading skills and composition skills, would rearrange that music from uptown, primarily Baptist gospel music, and out of Baptist church it would come jazz, rearranged by these Afro-Creoles, spirituals.
Yeah, because it's interesting. People, they say, well, jazz came from work songs and it came from spirituals, and of course that's part of it. But you don't also say, and there was also this huge cohort of highly skilled, highly trained Afro-Creole musicians who brought their knowledge and their experience and their expertise and their sophistication, their high level of sophistication. Because New Orleans, now New Orleans is a smallish city compared to New York or Houston or L.A. But the times that we're talking about, New Orleans was on par with New York City. In the 19th century,
it was the epicenter of culture, French and Spanish.
Yeah,
classical music.
Yeah,
in New Orleans, not New York.
Yeah. Think about that. Now you don't realize that because of the passage of time and different places have evolved. But New Orleans was the place of culture and sophistication and high level music. So if you were a working musician in New Orleans in the French Opera House or any of the other high end venues, you were among the best of the best musicians in the country. So when you talk about, how did jazz, this amazing thing, come to be? Of course, work songs, of course, spirituals, of course, the blues. But you can't leave out this huge generation and contribution of very, very skilled often conservatory skilled trained musicians who brought that. That's why I would say that's why jazz is one of the reasons why jazz is as sophisticated as it is, and it is a very sophisticated music, theoretically, harmonically. It's always been, and it has an amazing capacity to absorb other influences too. And it's created a language that people all over the world, basically, if you're a good musician, whether you're living in Bulgaria or Japan or South Africa, if you're a really good musician, you're attracted to jazz because jazz gives you the most room to be innovative and creative. And that was created by this collaboration of uptown musicians and French Creole, Afro-Creole musicians from New Orleans. That's a very important part of jazz history, and we can't really talk about it too much. Now,
well, here's one last footnote before we move on. Barney Bigard, who performed clarinet and saxophone with Duke Ellington, who supposedly composed Mood Indigo, he also performed sax and clarinet with Louis Armstrong. His professor of music was Lorenzo Tio Jr., who was born in Veracruz, Mexico, and studied in Mexico, came back to Treme and taught Barney, one of the guys, to play his instrument. That's never talked about. That is never discussed.
Yeah, there's this whole other dimension which would be for another call, and certainly for a visit to the museum, Treme's Petit Jazz Museum. We're talking with Al Jackson, the director. You know, we've talked about the Afro-Creole contribution to jazz, which is important because it's just not talked about enough. But we also could be talking about the Veracruz contribution, certainly the Cuban contribution. There were a lot of elements that went into making this music, and there was a lot of free travel between all those places. It was easier. You know, remember, this is before the era of the highway and the automobile, and frankly, the country was pretty primitive in the 19th century in most places. I mean, Chicago was just a couple of shacks and streets that weren't paved, you know, in the 19th century. So if somebody wanted to do business and be exposed to culture and get in front of refined audiences, well, they were on a boat going between New Orleans and Veracruz and Havana. They were not going to L.A. There was no L.A. You know, they weren't going to Chicago. There was no Chicago, you know. And it was easier to sail to Havana than to get to New York. And it was easier to get to Veracruz even than to get to New York or Merida or one of those places. You know, the balance of power and the balance of economics has really shifted in the 20th century. But if we go back in time to the 19th century, there was a lot of wealth, and wealth attracts sophistication and attracts music and musical sophistication and conservatories and opera houses and orchestras and you know, music masters, and that all was happening, I say, south of the 30th parallel. You know,
hey Ken, just to buttress your statement, the first opera to premiere on the soil which become known as America, the opera left Havana, Cuba. It was brought to New Orleans. Sylvain by Andre Gretry, 1793.
There you go. So, you know, we live in a different world today, but if we want to understand the roots of this music that we love so much, we will be fascinated the more you get into the early history, the prehistory of jazz, the soil, that the earth that made this music possible in the first place. Get back into the 19th century, and suddenly Havana and New Orleans and Veracruz and all those, you know, I know, for example, the saxophone was brought, my understanding, I could be wrong and you'd be the guy to correct me, but the saxophone was really brought to the United States mostly via Mexico when the Mexican Cavalry Band came to perform at Cotton Exposition. 1884,
World International Cotton Exposition.
Yeah,
1884. So you're right.
There's a whole lot of things that we take for granted that we don't know where they came from. And if you're talking about early roots of jazz, we're basically talking. I looked it up on the map. So New Orleans is a little south of the 30th parallel, the 30th latitude, and then of course everything else, you know, Havana and Veracruz and other places are below that as well. Now, strangely enough, until Mr. Jackson came along, there was no museum dedicated to these issues. Now, you would think, you know, we're Americans. We always, you know, we raise the flag and say how proud we are that jazz is our unique creation, and that's a good thing. But we don't acknowledge the whole story, and the whole story includes Afro-Creoles. It includes Cuba. It includes Mexico. It includes a lot of other places, a lot of other inputs. And the only place that you can go to immerse yourself in this story is Treme's Petit Jazz Museum. And I want to encourage everybody to make sure it's a stop next time you go to New Orleans. And also, currently, right now, the museum is doing a GoFundMe campaign to help expand. Right now, it's a big room, And that room's got some amazing treasures in it. Your eyes will pop when you when you see some of the stuff that the museum has. And it's got, like every museum, it has treasures it needs to preserve. It needs more space to display what it's doing. It needs some promotional money to get the word out so that more people come, that create that sort of positive feedback loop. More people come, more people talk about it, possible to raise more money. So this is a very new museum. When did the museum open its doors for the first time?
July the 15th, 2017.
So guys, you're getting in. If you help this museum now, which I strongly encourage you to do, I have, and I can't think of a better strategic investment. Number one, you're getting in on the ground floor, right? This museum's not even a year old yet. But number two, it's telling an essential story. At the beginning of this call, we went through a few items about the life story of Louis Armstrong that popular history has completely wrong, and we corrected th都on this call, thanks to Mr. Jackson and his study and the documents that he's seen. How many other stories are there out there that have been told incorrectly or haven't been told at all? And I'm going to guess there's a lot. So this is, if you love the music and you want to support it at a very profound level, and I think knowing the true history of things is a way to get to a profound level of music. I can't think of anything better to do than support this museum. It's called Tremés, that's with an S, Trmes, Petit, Petit, Jazz Museum. And if you put that into Google or a search engine, the Facebook page will come up. And if the Facebook page comes up, a Kickstarter page will come up. And this is something I think, again, for jazz fans, I think this is a no-brainer. Even if it's just a few bucks, every little bit helps. And if a lot of people give a little, we'll get there. And I just, we've got to do this. We've got to have a place on this earth that pays honor to the people who created the climate and the culture and the civilization that made it possible for jazz to arise. And that's clearly New Orleans, and that's clearly people from the 30th parallel and below. Hey, Al, do you want to add anything?
Of course, I want to thank Ken and Jazz on the Tube. You've been a friend or supporter, and we really appreciate it. And to those listeners, we need your help. We are less than a year old, but we're ready to expand. And we're not looking to expand for another building. Same building, we're taking the upper two floors, the second floor, to expand into an exhibition and research area, which would accommodate scholars from anywhere they might want to come from, and allow us to also have a performance and teaching element on the first floor to keep this music going and the history going, so the young folk will understand why this beat we play when our second line parades, as an example, that it didn't come from New Orleans. It was brought to New Orleans by Haitian Cubans by way of West Africa. It's so important that the brass would come from the Prussians or the Germans through Mexico and the Civil War. There's so much that we need to tell to people in general. And we need the help. And please visit the Facebook page, Tremés Petit Jazz Museum. And whatever you can contribute, we really would appreciate. And Ken, thank you very much again.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine, really. And everybody, just definitely take a look and spread the word too about this. We got a pretty good listenership here, and if everybody told one person about this interview, and just let them know, just tell everybody, for example, that Louis Armstrong probably was born on the 4th of July, 1900. That there's no proof that he was born any other date. That alone, and that this comes from the Tremés Petit Jazz Museum, and there's all kinds of other things to learn about Louis Armstrong and about New Orleans and about the history of jazz. So, Al, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to chat with you about things. I'm always getting enlightened. You're always on my agenda when I come to New Orleans. It's one of the first places I want to set. I also encourage people going to New Orleans, too, to do that as well. It's in a beautiful neighborhood, very historic neighborhood, not far from the French Quarter. You can walk there in about maybe 15 minutes. It's not far at all. So, Al, keep up the great work. Thank you for all your contributions, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, guys. Take care, and we're looking forward to see you again.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the Internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.